In this video, we will show you how to replace your front pressed-in wheel bearing on this Toyota Sienna. This will be located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing you need to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. Once you've done that, continue on to removing all 5 of your 21mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now that we have the wheel off, have a quick look at the brakes. We're going to have to disassemble them to gain access. If it looks like they have to be replaced, now's the time to do it. The next thing we'll do, since we have to remove the caliper from the area, is carefully push back our 2 caliper pistons. To push back the caliper pistons, we'll make our way inside of these ports, use a small pry bar, and gently pry against the caliper and the rotor, forcing it to the outward position, which will push in the pistons. Once you have movement from this area, we'll move along the backside, removing the 2 caliper bracket mounting bolts. With those out of the way, a quick inspection of the pads and we'll hang the entire thing aside, putting no pressure on the flex hose. Looking along the backside here, you're going to find 2 17mm headed mounting bolts holding this in place. There's one down bottom, one just above it. We'll start with the top. Fully remove that bolt, a quick inspection, start it back in, just a couple threads to hold this in place while we continue removing the lower bolt. A quick inspection of those brake pads, as I had mentioned. If it looks like they're worn or damaged in any way, go ahead and replace your front brakes. The next thing we'll do is just go ahead and set this aside, as I mentioned, making sure we put no pressure on our flex hose. We don't want to cause any damage to that. Now we should be able to remove the rotor from the area. Just give it a quick inspection. I will be replacing the brakes on this vehicle. Let's get the backing plate off of here by removing 4 10mm headed mounting bolts. You can see 2 out in the open over here. The other 2 are on the opposite side. We'll start with this upper one. Start that back in just a couple threads. Make our way down to this forward one. Let's make our way to the other 2. At this point, you can see this is freely moving around. We'll fully remove that first mounting bolt that we had started in a couple threads. Slide this right out of place. A quick inspection, and we'll set this aside. With that out of the way, we'll remove our ABS sensor. Use a 10mm to remove the mounting bolt. Take hold of the sensor, we'll give it a little wiggle and slide it out of there. Follow the wiring harness up to its mounting point along the top of the knuckle here, closest to where it connects to your front strut. For this, you'll find you have a plastic anchor point. You want to pull on that locking tab, and then we can set this aside. Now we can move along to remove our outer tie rod end from our steering knuckle. Along the bottom area here, you're going to find a 17mm nut. Typically, you're going to find a cotter pin in this area. Use some cutters, remove it, and set it aside for recycling. Use our 17mm for this. Now we'll cause some vibration on the steering knuckle here, breaking the tie rod end free from it. You want to be careful when doing this. We don't want to cause any damage to the knuckle or the tie rod end. Move along to removing your 30mm 12-point axle nut. The next thing we have to do is break the axle nut free from the wheel hub here. To do this, you want to use a hammer and punch directly in the center to break this free. Now let's move to the upper portion of the knuckle where it connects onto your front strut. In this area, you're going to find that you have two 22mm bolts, and along the back side, you have two 22mm mounting nuts. As for the first bolt, we're going to go ahead and remove the mounting nut, but we'll start it back on just a couple threads. Fully remove the lower bolt. Definitely got some movement there. Just a quick inspection of that hardware. It's important to make sure this hardware is in good condition. If it looks like it's rotted and damaged, you want to go ahead and replace it. This one looks fine. We'll set it aside. Now moving from the top, we're going to make our way all the way down along the bottom of the steering knuckle now. We're going to dislodge the lower ball joint from the lower control arm. In this area, you'll find that you have one 17mm mounting bolt and two 17mm mounting nuts. We'll start by removing the 17mm bolt. The next thing we'll have to do is carefully start pulling down on the control arm so we can pull the ball joint out and away. If you have a hard time pulling it down by hand, you could use a pry bar. We'll just make our way across that control arm. Gently pivot this. Slide that ball joint out from underneath that control arm. Let's take hold of the steering knuckle. Gently start pulling it away from the vehicle. You can see the axle sliding out of there. While we're holding on to this, we're going to remove our final mounting bolt up across the top here. Keep in mind, the steering knuckle with the bearing in it can be a little heavy. There we are. Now we can get this over to the bench. Now on the bench, we're going to make sure that we're holding this steady, and we'll have a look along the back side. In the area where we had the axle making its way through, you're going to find that you have a small shield that makes its way around. We have to go ahead and remove that. To remove that, you can use a small prying device. We will be reusing this, so we want to be careful not to damage it. Start prying that up and out. A quick inspection of this. You want to make sure it's not rotted. We'll also make sure that we do pay attention to this for the installation. This is where the ABS sensor will be located. We'll go ahead and clean this up and set it aside. With that shield out of the way, we'll use some penetrant along the backside here. If you were to pay close attention, you're going to find a snap ring that makes its way all the way around. That snap ring does have 2 ears for you to grab onto with snap ring pliers. We'll give it a little squeeze and slide this out of place. When you go to slide it out of place, you want to be careful for any pinch point. So once we do start squeezing on the snap ring, we'll use a small pick to help pry it out of place rather than our fingers. Give your snap ring a thorough inspection. If it looks like it's rotted and weak, you have to go ahead and replace it. This one's just got a little bit of rust and it's still in good condition. We'll be reusing this. And now we can get this over to our press. Over at the press, we need to make sure we have an area for the wheel hub to be able to go down and into when we do press it out of the steering knuckle and bearing. We'll get this in place. When we support this, we're going to be supporting by the ears where the caliper bracket should go, and then also where the tie rod end would go. Once again, we do need to make sure we have an area for that bearing hub to go down and into. The next thing we'll need to use is a 30mm socket or an adapter that's approximately the same diameter. We want to only press on that bearing hub directly in the center here, not on the bearing itself. Let's see if we can squeeze this in here. It's a little bit of a tight fit. Before you continue applying any pressure, you want to make sure that you're as secure as possible as far as the knuckle is concerned. We want to be on each of these ears. And then also, as I mentioned, on the area where your tie rod end will go. Ensure that this cannot slide around on you. We're going to start applying pressure, driving that hub down and out of the bearing now. While doing so, if it feels like it's binding, something might be off kilter, and you don't want to cause any damage, just go ahead and pause, readjust if necessary. I'm just going to give this a little spin so you can see exactly what's going on. You can see the hub making its way down and out of here. We'll be careful for any pinch points. We will be reusing that hub. There's our hub with our outboard race, which we will be removing, but we'll set this aside temporarily. We have the knuckle turned over, and it's stable on each one of our adapters, as level as possible. To press the bearing out of here, we want to make sure we're only pressing on the bearing and not on the knuckle itself. We'll use an adapter that fits directly over this. Make sure everything's properly aligned as close to center as possible. All right, at this point, most of the bearing's out, but we need to continue pressing the rest of this race out of here. Just carefully stack some adapters here. Once again, making sure we're as close to centered as possible. Just switch up our adapters as necessary. All right, we can see this starting to come out now. And there's what's left to it. We'll set that aside for recycling. Let's clean out the inside of the steering knuckle where the brand new bearing will go. Be careful for any shards of metal. You don't want to cut yourself. When cleaning this, you want to pay close attention to the outboard side here. We want to make sure it's a smooth surface for the bearing to press up against during the installation process. Just give this a quick inspection. We can set this aside. To remove the bearing race from your bearing hub, we're going to use an air chisel and carefully start working it off of there. Other people might try to heat it up and work it off, or you could try to cut just the race, but either way, you want to be extremely careful not to cause any damage to the hub itself. Over on the bench, we can start removing the bearing race from the bearing hub. Now to do this, people might try several different things. Typically for it though, you're going to have to at least cut a small notch on this to release pressure. After that, generally you can use a hammer and punch or an air chisel and go ahead and just drive this right off. Either way, you want to be extremely careful not to cause any damage to the hub because we will be reusing this. Now with the race off of the hub, we'll go ahead and set this aside, and back at the press, we're going to press on the brand new wheel bearing directly into that steering knuckle. Let's take that bearing and we'll rest it down into position, making sure it's as close to level as possible. We'll align everything. Now when we go to press this in, I need to mention, you never want to press on the center or on the middle ring here. You only press the bearing down by the outer portion, the casing. To easily find an adapter that'll press directly against that, use your original bearing housing. We'll use an adapter in this area. And now we'll continue on by applying pressure straight down and into this area. If it feels like it's binding, something might be off kilter. You'd want to make an adjustment before you continue. So right there, it feels as though it wants to stop. We'll just apply a little bit more pressure here. Use a small hammer to cause some vibration. Release pressure. At this point, you need to have a close look where the bearing connects to the knuckle along the backside. Ensure that you can see the groove where your snap ring will go. This is extremely important. Assuming you can see that, we'll get this over to the bench and install the snap ring. To install the snap ring, you want to come in at an angle. We'll start pressing in one ear first. Continuing on from there, we'll be using our snap ring pliers. Once again, this will be under spring tension. Be extremely careful for any pinch points. When you do press this into position, we'll use a small pry bar for this, never our fingers. We don't want to potentially get hurt. Once you feel as though it is in the groove, we'll continue on by tapping along it all the way around, just to make sure it's completely seated. One last quick confirmation here, and we'll make our way back over to the press. Over at the press, we'll be continuing with our original bearing casing. Rest that on a flat plate. We'll rest this hub directly on it, making sure that we're putting no pressure on any of our lug studs. We'll continue on by putting the bearing and hub over this area. Get that as close to lined up perfectly as possible. Now we'll continue on with the bearing race that we had removed from the original hub. We're going to take this and put it over the inboard race. Should fit perfectly. Continue on by applying pressure directly on this area only. By applying pressure on the center race area, it's going to make it so it holds pressure in this area, and it'll allow us to drive that hub up inside of the bearing. Got a spacer here. Just going to put that right across. Start applying some pressure here. While we continue pressing this down, we'll be paying attention in this area. What we need to happen is this flat base of the hub itself will press up against the outboard race of that wheel bearing. Once you start feeling some pressure here, you want to pause and confirm you're completely seated. Right there's where it felt as though it applied a little bit more pressure, so we'll just give this a close inspection and a couple taps to ensure everything's completely seated. After our confirmation, let's go ahead and pull this off of here. We'll have a quick look in this area. As you can tell, you can't see any of the hub protruding out. We can still spin this with no binding, and none of our lug studs are damaged. Let's get this back over to the bench. On the bench, we're going to clean up the back side of the knuckle, just along the back of the bearing where that snap ring's located. As you remember, during the disassembly process, we had removed this tin shield. I also mentioned the port where the ABS sensor would have to go. We cleaned it up, and now we can take this and put it in position. We're paying attention to where the ABS sensor would go through the steering knuckle in comparison to where it would go through this tin. Make sure everything's aligned. Once you do have it aligned, go ahead and tap it into the proper position. Make sure it's secure. Once again, confirming that we can make our way through this port with our ABS sensor. Assuming everything's properly seated, we can get this over to the vehicle. Before we can install the knuckle with our brand new bearing, have a look at the axle. We want to make sure we clean down the splined area here to confirm it's not rotted or damaged. Use a wire brush, some parts cleaner if necessary. That seems good. The next thing you want to do is use some anti-seize along the splined area, but not necessarily on the threaded portion of the axle. Just spread that around with a gloved finger. Now we can install our bearing and knuckle. We'll start by sliding the axle through the bearing hub. You can see it start to protrude through there. We'll continue on to taking that ball joint. We're going to try to align it with that lower control arm. If necessary, you could pull down on the control arm to get everything aligned. We'll continue on to swinging this up into the proper position along the lower portion of your front strut. Continue on with your mounting bolts here. We're just going to slide them right on through there. Get the next one on there. Now we'll snug each of these and then torque them to 184 foot-pounds. Now let's move down to where the ball joint connects to your lower control arm. In this area, we'll start with our mounting bolt. You want to make sure you start that in by hand. We don't want to cross-thread it, of course. Start on each of the mounting nuts. After that, you can go ahead and snug them up, and we'll be torquing these to 65 foot-pounds. get this tie rod end in place. Start on the mounting nut, torque that to 36 foot-pounds. Once you have the nut torqued, the next thing you want to do is pay attention to the slots on the mounting nut in comparison to the hole through the tie rod stud. If it's not aligned, you need to continue tightening the nut until the very next slot is. After that, put through your locking cotter pin and pin it over so there's no way this nut can loosen up on you while you're driving down the road. Now it's time for our axle nut. When tightening this, you never want to use an impact tool because you could cause damage to your brand new bearing that you just installed. We'll make sure we use a hand ratchet and we'll torque it to manufacturer's specification. The torque for your axle nut is 217 foot-pounds. What you'll find when you go to tighten this is that the hub will want to spin on you. If that's the case, make your way closer to the ground. We'll be using a long pry bar, bring it diagonally across some of the studs here, holding this in place. Once you do have it torqued, the next thing you need to pay attention to is the slot on the axle shaft. You can see it right along here. We're going to use a hammer and punch and drive a portion of the nut down into that groove, locking it in the proper position. Go a little further here, just for good measure. Perfect. Now it's time to reinstall our ABS sensor. We'll take this and get it in place. Start in the mounting bolt there. Start in that mounting bolt, snug it up, torque that to 60 inch-pounds. Let's get this bracket in place. Before we can install our backing plate, the next thing I always like to do is use some anti-seize inside of each one of the mounting bolt ports. Let's get ready to install our backing plate. Now when we go to install this, we're going to have to gently try to stretch this a little bit so we can slide it over the steering knuckle. Just requires a little bit of pressure here. Once you do have it in place, start in each one of the mounting bolts, but don't tighten any of them up until all of them are started. Once you have them started, you can go ahead and snug them up. The torque for these is 73 inch-pounds. Once you have that torqued, double check to make sure it's completely secured in the proper placement. Before we continue putting the brakes back together, it's important to make sure you clean up the mating surfaces between your wheel bearing hub and the back side of the rotor. To do this, we can use a wire brush or even a small piece of sandpaper. Once you have both of those areas cleaned up, use some anti-seize on the mating surface. Now we'll install our brake rotor. Hold that in place with one of your original lug nuts. Now we can get the caliper with bracket in place. We'll reinstall our mounting bolts. For these, I'll be using some blue thread lockers, start them in by hand, and torque them to 77 foot-pounds. Double check to make sure the flex hose is not twisted, which could restrict brake fluid flow. This looks perfect. We'll get this lug nut off of here, reinstall the wheel. Start on all 5 of your 21mm lug nuts. We'll bottom these out. Get the wheels safely back down on the ground, and we can torque these to 76 foot-pounds. With the wheels safely on the ground, we'll be torquing these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay friend, we showed you how to install the front wheel bearing on one side of the vehicle. The process for one side of the vehicle is the exact same thing as the other. Once you've completed your process, go ahead and hop inside the passenger compartment, pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm, take your vehicle for a road test, listen for funny noises, and get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.